everybody. Welcome to today's National Teen Book Club broadcast. We're delighted you've been able to join us. Thank you so much. This Q&A will last around 45 minutes. We'll start with a quick introduction to our guest speaker and then move on to questions and discussion. So joining us today is Moïra Fowley-Doyle. Moïra is half French, half Irish, and lives in Dublin, where they write magical realism, read tarot cards, and raise witch babies. Moira's first novel, The Accident Season, was followed by the second novel, Spellbook of the Lost and Found. And we are going to be talking about their other book today, All the Bad Apples. So this session is the 4th in 6 author talks, which are linked to our hero read for the term, which is Charlotte Bronte's Gothic classic, Jane Eyre, and Patrice Lawrence's abridged retelling of the story. After that intro, it won't surprise you to hear that, like Jane Eyre, there is a supernatural element to All the Bad Apples, which deals with dark family history, tragedy, love, and hope as the characters grapple with their circumstances, their identity, and their destinies. We're going to speak to Moïra now, and it's Discover Creative Careers Week. So do submit your questions about Moira's career to date, as well as about their book recommendations and influences. You can submit your questions via the Q&A Slido function underneath the stream on your screen, which you may have to scroll down a bit to see. You can also submit questions via the QR code on the screen or by typing in the code online. The Q&A function will be open throughout the discussion, so you can join in at any time. And if you're experiencing any issues with the stream, please let us know and we will try our best to support you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. So our first question, please will you tell us a bit more about your book? We know that a school wanted to know if the book related to real life. That school, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, it's Dua Martyrs Catholic School. So they wanted to know a bit more about your book, and they also asked if it relates to real life.
If it relates to real life. Okay, so All the Bad Apples is the story of 17-year-old Dina, whose older sister Mandy disappears right after she comes out to her quite intolerant, sort of old-fashioned father, and her sister has always said that she was branded a bad apple by the family, so that the rest of their kind of very conservative family that there was a curse on the bad apples of this family, where those who didn't conform were cast off the family tree, and bad things would happen to them, and that they would know that that the curse had come to them when they heard the scream of a banshee. So Dina hears a banshee's scream, and so thinks that this is for Mandy, and she then has to sort of retrace the roots of her family tree in order to break the curse before it comes to her. Is it related to anything in real life? It's a really good question, and it's always a very difficult question to answer, because I think most writers take snippets from real life, but sort of Dina's story isn't my story at all. But the story of her family tree, the sort of things that happen to the women in her family specifically, who are branded bad apples, who are cast off the family tree and cursed, or so she thinks, are the stories of a lot of women in Ireland throughout history. And some of those stories, a lot of kind of what happens to Dina's ancestors came from stories that were shared with me through. So my mum used to work as a creative writing facilitator for older people, and around the time that I was writing All the Bad Apples, there was an investigation into the mother and baby homes in Ireland in the past. So the mother and baby homes were places where often women who had children outside of marriage would be sent to these mother and baby homes to have their babies, and then the babies would be kept by the church, and would be given for adoption, often against the parents' will, the mother's will. And so a lot of details about these places were coming out when I was writing and researching for All the Bad Apples. So some of those stories that were real life stories from older people in Ireland at the time, who it seemed like everybody had a story, whether it was not from themselves, it was maybe from family members, from neighbors, from classmates, and it seemed to sort of just be this huge secret, this huge generational sort of secret that had that was only just starting to come out, that everybody sort of knew about at the time but weren't really talking about. And so so while some of the stories did come from real life, none of it came from my life, I suppose.
Thank you for going into that. And it's such a moving book as well, and really important to reflect on history also. I know Savitri is having some tech issues today, so we will try and alternate questions as we can. It's okay, yeah. Do you want to go ahead, Savitri?
You've answered this question a little bit, Moira. We know Dame Elizabeth's Cadbury School were keen to understand more about the inspiration and motivation, but it's been described by Penguin as a novel about silenced female voices, family secrets, and dangerous truths. We partly chose it because of the beautiful writing and the important messages, and partly because that very much relates to Jane Eyre, the characters of Jane and Bertha. So both of these books explore societal issues and stigmas. Why is fiction a good vehicle for it, looking at our modern day world?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me have a think about that for a second. I think that what fiction does is it builds empathy, I suppose, or it creates connections, because when you're reading fiction, you are sort of you're brought into the head of, the body of, the life of a character who often is very different to you, which is why, you know, reading diversity is so important as well. And through reading somebody else's story, even if it is fiction, or maybe especially if it is fiction, I think it gives readers the ability to see other people's perspectives, to kind of open their worlds. And while reading history books can be really interesting, there's, I think personally for me, it's the human connection to the past, to other people, to society, that's the really important piece. And I feel like fiction is a really sort of rich way to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And we've actually got a question from a school that I think relates to that question and answer as well. So All the Bad Apples was published in 2019. But if you were to rewrite it today, would there be anything that you would add or change to the story? That's from Ridgeway Academy.
Oh, that's a great question. Because often when I finish a book, it's finished. I don't think about how I could improve it, which is if for people who write, it's a good way to do things, to separate yourself from the work, because once it's finished, there's nothing you can do about it. So sort of worrying about how you could have improved it, which I know is not the question, but I do tend to just sort of put it down. How would I write it differently? Do you know? I'm not sure. I think I think it was always going to be this story. I think that there were always elements of Irish history, elements of sort of the family secrets, the generational trauma, kind of these themes in the book that I could have branched out with, or that I could have expanded, or like characters that I could have, but I think there was always going to be this story. And because I think it is also, so I wrote it came out in 2019, but it's set in 2012. So I think because it was always going to be specifically that kind of period, the main story, the core of Dina's story is set in 2012. I think it was always going to be this story. But that is a really interesting question that I think I'm probably going to keep with me in the back of my head.
All the Bad Apples, as you were talking about, does move between those different time periods, that family history. Did you write the book chronologically, or did you pick a character and a period and stick with them? And how did you ensure that the research process was like?
Okay, so firstly, did I write it chronologically? More or less, or rather, I wrote it pretty much as it's laid out in the book, I suppose. So I wrote Dina's story sort of chronologically, and then dipped in and out of the past sections. So my research, I'm a messy researcher. I'm a very scattered note keeper, and I go down rabbit holes. So I fixate on a certain element of something that I've learned, and I will just follow it until I get lost in the brambles. And so because I knew this about myself, and because I was completely stepping out of my comfort zone by writing a novel with historical fiction elements, and I'm not a historian. It's not in my background. I didn't study history or anything like that. So what I did was I knew that I'm a bad researcher and I had a certain amount of time to write the book. So I dedicated maybe, I want to say the guts of a year, maybe 6 months to research before even writing a single word of the book. And mostly what I did was, in my scattered, haphazard way, I read a lot about, checked out books in the library about life in Ireland at the time. I looked up the amount of rabbit holes I fell down, looking at statute marriage laws in the 1800s, looking at all of these things that didn't actually make their way into the book, but that sort of added to the general idea that I needed to have of life at the time, because the historical elements go from sort of the late 1800s all the way to the present day, or 2012. But yeah, so I read everything I could. I took a load of notes, and I read. I searched out first-hand accounts of the Magdalen laundries, of the mother and baby homes, and they were very difficult to read. It was. It was very emotional. It was very hard to read that. And I have 2 children, and they were very young at the time. And so it was also very, it was a very emotionally charged research process. But then once I had done my vague, scattered research, not knowing exactly what I was going to use it for or do with it, I wrote the historical passages sort of in the same order as they come into the book, but I wrote them longhand. They just didn't want to be typed out, so I wrote them all longhand. And once I had kind of transferred all of that into the one manuscript, then I had to go back and do a little bit more research just to make sure that things were accurate. So if I mentioned a radio, in the early 1900s, I had to go and find out how many households would have had radios, and but also, because I'm not a historian, because I'm not writing a history book, I did allow myself a certain amount of leeway for, like, maybe the historical accuracy wasn't as important as the story and the characters.
Thank you for that, Moïra. And just while you touched on, the book does explore some heavy topics. So how did you look after your own well-being when writing? I
did a lot of coming back to nature and to the body, and to so I did a lot of sort of something that I found very helpful writing all of my books, actually, is sort of even just a 5-minute kind of morning meditation, just to kind of to ground yourself and anchor yourself in reality almost, or in your body, and to kind of, remind you that you are where you are. You're not in the book that you're writing. You're not in the work that you're doing. And I found that very helpful. And taking long walks in the forest or just around the area was very helpful as well. And I think I also did a lot of being cozy, which sounds really obvious and really kind of, but I did a lot of, like, wrapping up in blankets and lighting candles and reading books that were lighter, and or maybe not lighter, but reading books that took me out of the kind of research I was doing. But also part of minding myself in it was also writing about it, because there was a lot going on in Ireland at the time, around the kind of mother and baby homes, and around activism to kind of repeal the Eighth Amendment, which I might go into later, but there was sort of a lot going on that people were fighting for, and part of what helped me through that time was also writing this story, was the idea that the tagline on the book is "Shatter the Silence," was the idea of destigmatizing certain things and being able to kind of to write about that to not feel like there was this kind of cloud of silence around certain things.
Thank you, that's really interesting. We've got so many great questions, particularly we've got getting quite a few from 5 Acres High School. Thank you for those. I'm going to ask just one from them for now. Did your extensive research alter your way of thinking or give you a different view on life afterwards?
Oh, wow. So that is a great question. I think so to a certain extent. I think that because I'd never done anything like that before, because the research that I had done before for university, for other books, was always, so I have a degree in French and English literature, and I did a master's in English literature as well. So I was always researching fiction and literary theory, and never actually I hadn't read firsthand kind of accounts or or done a lot of sort of historical research. And I think it does. I think it did. I think it did change the way that I wrote my characters anyway, which I think hadn't really occurred to me until that question, which was like such a great question. But I think that there is, because I'm someone who writes, who doesn't think of their readers when I write. When I write my first draft, I'm not thinking this is going to be read by people and how is it going to be taken. I write mostly kind of for myself, really, which sounds very selfish, but for my younger self, for these novels. And I think it's, and I get so lost in the writing that it's almost easy to, how do I say it? It's easy to forget that that the characters in my books can be like real people who really lived and who kind of had these experiences that are so different from my experiences. And so I think there was definitely a part of not quite a reality check, but something like that like it was, it definitely made me think about characters and stories and how I approach that, I suppose. Yeah, because I make a lot of things into a story. I make people into stories. I make lives into stories. But actually, sometimes it's very helpful. But also sometimes it's good to remember that actually, like, there are real people behind the sort of seeds of these stories.
Thank you. And we wanted to ask about the power and legacy of words and stories. So your author's note at the beginning of the book, All the Bad Apples, says there's great power in sharing stories. And our hero read is Jane Eyre, which has been retold, abridged by Patrice Lawrence, as well as many other people. It's been retold in different ways. You know, it's had such a long life. Can you talk to us about the legacy of words? And another question, do you have any advice for book clubbers wanting to make a difference?
I think that the idea of sharing stories in All the Bad Apples is in part about breaking stigma, because silence amplifies stigma. So if there's not the sort of representation, I suppose, if people aren't talking about different ways of being, different ways of living, because the bad apples in Dina's family, for example, are just very simply women in the family who don't conform. So if there is silence around anything that's considered different, that makes the world small. So I think that almost the most basic thing that I would say, both as advice and as something that's important in this book anyway, is the idea of not swallowing your own truth, because that's sort of the first step. And some of the time it's what's going to be helpful for others. So having the validation, having the mirror of somebody else. And I know that fiction does that. So for anyone who is a writer, you know, to write stories like yours, stories not like yours, to not be afraid to speak truth to the page, but also in person and in real life, and being able to, I think there's great privilege in being able to be a mirror for people. So in whatever way that is. And I'm trying to bring in the first part of your question, if you could remind me.
Yeah, just about the power and legacy of stories and words, and how, you know, we're exploring a hero read that's been retold, and your book is also about sharing stories and sharing history. How important is that?
Thank you. Yes, I think that there are stories that capture us for lots of different reasons. I think Jane Eyre is one of those, but there's so many that deal with sort of like universal, timeless kind of themes, and that kind of the sharing and resharing of a story, whether it's your own story, whether it's your own truth, or whether it is the stories that we love and that we grow up with, and that say something about humans life, that, you know, that's I suppose that's how we relate to others. We relate to others through story a lot of the time. That's kind of and so yeah, I feel like continuing to share that and kind of amplify that creates that connection.
Thank you. We've got a great question from Ridgeway Academy, but we do have one more from 5 Acres First, which I think links to what you've just said, and also will allow us to ask a question about Jane Eyre. So we'll come back to yours, Ridgeway, don't worry. But 5 Acres High School want to know, during that writing and research stage, you talked a bit more broadly, generally about novels, but did you take any inspiration from other novels? If so, which ones, and how much impact do they have on your stories? I guess if not All the Bad Apples, maybe other stories that you've worked on.
So I don't think of this as research, but actually it is. I often have companion books, sort of like a little syllabus for each novel that I write, that are sort of my inspiration reads, I suppose. That some of them I go to for voice, as in how sort of the vibe of how I want the book to sound. Some of them for like for time and space. Some of them just for different elements. And often they're fiction books. Pretty much all the time they are, because in All the Bad Apples, it was kind of, my research was a lot more scattered than that, and I should really have written down where my sources were from. But although I say that, and in Spellbook of the Lost and Found, one of those books that influenced it and that I read alongside it was I forgot the name of it now. It's a non-fiction book. It's about Irish trees, and kind of with the explaining about all of these different kind of trees and the mythology around them, and how, you know, their uses throughout Irish history. But that was for my second book. So which fiction books did I read alongside All the Bad Apples? The answer to that is I forget. I'll keep that one like in my head, and if I remember at some point, I will say it. Because I remember some of the books that I was reading alongside some of the books that I was writing, but I can't remember exactly which ones. I know that I read a fair amount of A.S. King's books. She's an American author of YA fiction, and she writes she has this novel called I Crawl Through It, that's sort of surreal and very odd in a beautiful way, and has nothing to do with any of my books, because it's sort of about American standardized testing. But there was something in the way that in the structure of that book, and in the way that it was very odd and kind of surreal, that I really liked, and that I wanted to kind of keep in mind. What else would I have read? I can't remember exactly, but to answer the other part of the question, everything I read influences what I write in some way. And so, there are certain books that I keep on my desk as a stack when I'm writing each separate book, and they do kind of they have a conversation, I suppose.
Thank you. And I'm going to come back to that question from Ridgeway Academy. So they obviously admired your book. One thing that stood out in your book was the brilliant characterization. Do you have a particular favourite character from your book and why?
All right, so I'm going to have two answers to this one. One is like very obviously is Dina, because because I was in her head when I was writing the whole book, and she was a funny character to write because she kind of emerged already with her own personality. Some characters I have to really work at to get to know, to get their voice, to really understand them, their motivations, their feelings. Whereas Dina, I felt, was a very although she was someone who was holding quite a lot of kind of secrets and shame and confusion, she was still a very, very kind of open character to kind of get to know. And I found her also quite funny because she has a bit of a kind of a deadpan humor sometimes, which I really, really enjoyed writing as well. So I think she was my favorite. Is my favorite character to write. But the other answer is there's a character that has shown up in almost all of my books so far, whose name is Mags McGuire. And she shows up in All the Bad Apples. She's a very small kind of character, a very minor character, who is a possibly ageless, possibly witch woman who turns up just at the right time to slightly help the characters along and slightly help the narrative along. And it's a literary device called a Deus Ex Machina, which is a character or something, an element of the story that comes in at just the right time to just propel the story forward. And I really like her she's this sort of very kind of gruff, abrupt, like no nonsense, stocky, sturdy woman who's old, whatever that means, and has a series of dogs that she replaces one after the other. And I really love her, and I love putting her into, just kind of sliding her into my books, but hopefully without anybody noticing. But
love that, and she is a great character. We have some questions which I think are from schools, but we don't have the names of those schools, so I can't shout you out. So do flag us the names if you want us to reference those. 5 Acres High School have asked, out of all your novels, which one's been the easiest and most entertaining to write?
I think that my first novel, The Accident Season, was the easiest to write. I don't know about most entertaining, because of how I write. I get get lost in my books, I suppose. So I don't feel like entertaining is good. It's always a very intense process. So it never quite feels entertaining. It can be fun, but mostly it's intense. But I think I think The Accident Season, which was my first book, was the easiest book to write. I think it's the one that the first draft came out very, very fast. And while every book changes from the first draft to the published draft, it changed quite a lot, but I think it was still the sort of the easiest one to write. And I'm not sure if that's because it was my first novel, so I wrote it before I had a publisher, and so maybe I had less kind of expectations or pressure, or maybe it was just the book that I had in my head that had to come out first before anything else, and so it was the easiest one to write.
Thank you, Moira. And we've got 2 questions from 5 Acres High School. How long have you been an author, and what made you want to become an author?
Okay, how long have I been an author? So my first book was published almost 10 years ago, so it'll be 10 years next July, which is a really long time, actually. There wasn't a specific thing that made me want to be an author, because I think I'd always wanted to. And I think part of that comes back to what we were talking about stories. Stories are how I have always made sense of the world. I've always kind of told my life as a story. I wrote diaries since I was 4. I have crates and crates of them, about 150 of them going strong now in a crate in my bedroom. And I was always a reader as well. And I've always loved reading pretty much whatever I could get my hands on from a very young age. And so there was never a point at which I thought I want to be an author, because I was always writing, and I was always writing stories. So I think the sort of roundabout answer to that question is probably that I always was. And I think that anyone who writes is a writer. Whether or not they are published is a whole other story. But yeah, I think more people who write should call themselves writers instead of saying aspiring writers, which is an aside. If you write, you're a writer. And yeah.
Thank you for that. We're always interested to hear about our speakers' experiences of studying English at school. Did you study Jane Eyre at school? Assuming you do, or if not, when did you read it? Because I know you're familiar with it. And is that the sort of book you would read for pleasure? You've talked more broadly. And by the way, there are a lot of books on Irish trees and mythology. If anybody wants to, I tried to narrow that down with Google, and I failed. There's lots. Yeah, so what do you enjoy reading? And we know that your new book, Eyes, Guts, Throat, Bones, Ears, a collection of short horror stories. And they're kind of neither All the Bad Apples nor Jane Eyre really lean into that, but there's elements of the supernatural. So yeah, just interested to know what genres are up there as a favourite.
Okay. So the first part of the question about Jane Eyre. So I didn't study it in secondary school, but I did in university. So I don't, but I think I had read it. I remember reading it in university. I think I had read it before. I think I had read it when I was in secondary school, because I loved Gothic fiction in general. I love horror. I always did as well, from kind of the very early Goosebumps books that I read as a child to all sorts of horror. But I went through a kind of a Gothic fiction phase in my late teens, and I'm fairly sure that I read Jane Eyre there, but I have a very, very bad memory. But I do remember coming back to it then in university, and I think because a lot of the people who had read it as well were sort of talking about it as a romance novel, or as a book with romance as its kind of main drive, which is not untrue, obviously, but that's not always the part that interested me. I was very interested in the kind of elements of the supernatural, in the darkness, in Bertha as a character, like fascinated by her.
Thank you so much. We had a question from a school. It's coming anonymously. Your novel could be seen as complex. It is quite a complex story with the different timelines and characters. How much work did it take? Did you write daily? What was your kind of writing process, and how did you keep the spark going?
Oh, okay, that is a great question. So part of it, the complexity of the sort of structure of it and the different timelines and everything, that's not something I'm very good at. I'm good at language, story, characters. I'm not very good at plot. And thankfully, I have excellent editors who kind of help me with the structure and the kind of plot, who will suggest, well, maybe this part can go here, and maybe you need to expand this part, and then so it's okay that I'm not very good at that. Timelines are my enemy, which is interesting for someone who wrote something with a lot of kind of timelines. But so how often did I write? I did write almost every day. Yeah, I think because at the time my like I've said, my kids were younger, and so they were in kind of preschool, so I kind of didn't have a whole lot of flexibility with time with young kids. Now that they're older, I can often just do what comes naturally to me, which is to write whenever I need it, I suppose. And sometimes I will start writing at 10 o'clock when they go to bed, and I will keep writing until 3 o'clock in the morning. And that's fine, because I don't have a 2-year-old to be taken care of. But so I think I did write pretty much every day. How did I keep the spark? In part by reading the kind of the stack of novels and stories that I took as inspiration, because that's always, if ever I lose that kind of spark, something that always helps is going to other people's stories, and to reading the kind of books that I know will fire that up again and will make me want to write. And also, I think, and this kind of comes back to what we were talking about much earlier, anger was that idea of frustration at the world, horror at the past, needing to do something. And I feel like maybe, especially these days, like a lot of people have that kind of feeling of like the world is so terrible in some ways, and wanting to help and not knowing how to, and feeling that sort of like that really deep frustration of like how do I make a difference. And that anger was also part of what I call that anger, but really it's not anger as we see it in a negative way, I suppose, but more as a kind of a driving force. That also kind of brought me back to, this is why I'm doing this. It's part of why I'm doing this. But so yeah, no, it was and for the structure of it and the timelines, I had a lot of physical timelines out on my wall with Post-it notes and things like that, and I'm trying to keep it all in my head, which is it's not something that I'm good at, as you might be able to tell. I'm a little bit scattered in my head to begin with, so like, yeah, trying to keep it all in one place was not the easiest thing.
Oh, thank you. That's a great response. I'm so sorry to the school who asked if there were any parts that were written that didn't make it into the published novel that, thinking back, you wish you did include. It sounds like there could be quite a lot, and we hate not to have time to sort of explore that in full detail, but we are conscious of coming to the end of the session, so we always end with a sort of careers advice question, and I think actually Dame Elizabeth Cadbury School have asked one, so we can come to that rather than the usual phrasing we would use. Dame Elizabeth Cadbury School, and I'm sure others on the call, want to know your advice. So do you have any tips for budding writers, storytellers, and creatives, or more broadly, any general careers advice that you would give our young people, or maybe your younger self?
That's a brilliant question. Yeah, so specifically for writers, or people who are interested in writing novels and becoming authors, or published authors, I suppose. The first one, that's maybe the most basic, but isn't something maybe that gets said enough, is to write the book. And I'm going to explain why this is because a lot of the time we as writers tend to be perfectionists, and I know that I was the same when I was younger. This where you have so many ideas, you have this drive, you have this passion, you have a love of words, and you have read widely, and you just know that you want to write, and you start to write, and either the spark goes, or you run out of steam, or you start to kind of fix your words as you go and say, oh no, it's not quite good enough, it's not quite good enough. Whereas you can't write without the words, I suppose. So there's a quote by an American author called Jane Eyre who says that every first draft is perfect because all a first draft has to do is exist. And so being able to just write the thing is sometimes the most basic thing of taking. My advice, I suppose, would be, if whatever way you have of silencing the voice that compares your work to others, use it, because your work needs to be told, your stories need to be told. It's a if you're a writer, right, I suppose. And aside from that, then afterwards is to read widely. What I find is one of the most helpful things for being able to write well is to go to your favorite books and kind of, especially if they're ones you've already read before. If you're a rereader, I definitely am. And I like to go back to my favorite books and ask myself, how do they do that? like what do I love about it? Like so is it the characters? Okay, what is so enticing or exciting about these characters, and how can I do that for my own characters? Or what makes me keep turning the pages? What is it about the pacing and the plot that's so exciting, and how can I do that with mine? Or even just the language, like how sometimes, like, why is this my favorite sentence? Is it because I find it very relatable, and how can I just sort of share my story or share my words in a way that will be relatable to others? Or is it because of the sounds? Is it because of the specific words or imagery that's used? And how can I do that, I suppose, would be a so the both sides are, don't compare yourself to others, but also use others' words as a comparison to how you could, not a comparison, but as inspiration, I suppose.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the amazing questions we had this week. That was brilliant, really inspiring. Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for today. So thank you so much, Moira, for taking the time to speak to our students about such a wide range of things. Clearly sort of struck a chord because we did get some really probing questions this week.
Thank you, Moira, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. So a feedback form will be shared with the educators soon via email. So we'd really appreciate both students and school staff completing this. We have also added a poll into our Slido Q&A box, so you can share some comments there instead, or as well as before you leave the webpage. We hope to see you at our other upcoming sessions for Jane Eyre, which are all on screen now. Please head to our National Teen Book Club webpage for more information and to register your groups. You could also find more broadcasts on the Speakers for Schools website, and we'll be sharing other Discover Creative Careers event information in our post-session email today as well. There's loads to get involved with for that. Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you again soon. We hope you enjoyed the session and hope you have a lovely day and rest of your week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.